This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Join us January 17th to the 19th for a hands-on dual workshop with Dita Mert and Jeremy Randall. Visit cornellstudiosupply.com to sign up. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 533 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today I'm talking with Michelle Eam, who is a New York City-based artist who uses low-fire tin glaze to make both vibrant patterned pottery and figurative sculpture. In our interview, we talk about her approach and technique for Majolica, developing her Ratchix brand, and her portrayal of familial identity in her sculptural work. You can read more about Michelle in my book, The Complete Guide to Low-Fire Glazes for Potters and Sculptors, and you can also visit ratxchicks.club. Before we get to this interview, I did want to mention that my holiday sale is now live. If you're looking for gifts for yourself or your loved ones, this is a great place to find them, and I'm happy to offer you, the listener, free shipping. To receive this special offer, make a purchase before December the 16th at carterpottery.com and use the offer code PODCAST at checkout. This offer is good for listeners in the continental United States only, but I did want to mention that I do ship internationally. You can shop now at carterpottery.com. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. I thought we could start talking about Majolica as a process and how that attracts you. So how did you get turned on to Majolica?
It's funny. Every time I hear that word, it's just, I don't know. I just light up inside, because it still makes me so excited. And it's really like about low fire in general. Like I've started working in primarily with like porcelain and on the wheel, and cone 10 was like everything. Cause like I started learning pottery at the Greenwich House Pottery 12 years ago. And also like, my uncle, he has a ceramics engineer background, and he owned a factory in China for 30 years, a ceramics factory. And so he's always like kind of put the importance on porcelain. And so naturally, also in Korea, like everything you see, it's like everything is porcelain. It's all about that. And so when I started like kind of moving away from Greenwich House Pottery and just starting to think about like developing my own work and artistic vision, whatnot, I started learning about low fire, and it just like clicked. I just was like looking at these European like low fire pieces. I didn't understand that they were low fire. And so then I just got really into that history of just like how it starts in China, this idea of the blue and white pottery and the importance of that, and it being a global brand. And then other artisans around the world just trying to figure out how to emulate it, copy it, and then just like, going along or looking at the travel of this, the different iterations of low fire to like Maiolica and how that came into existence. I think that whole history just really excites me. And also, I think personally, it kind of connects to the story of my uncle because he produced imitation Dutch Delftware in China, selling it back to souvenir shops in Europe and the US. And I didn't understand what all these pieces were about because, like, I grew up with all of his like tchotchkes and like, windmills and clogs, and I just didn't understand like what they were about because I had never been to Europe, but I was like, "Oh, these are nice." And then when I started learning about low fire, I was like, "Oh my God." Like and it's like the full circle coming back to China, and I find that whole history really exciting and interesting, and it really is about like cultural exchange, like global cultural exchange, which I feel very much tied to because I lived in Korea and the US and had this experience of experiencing both worlds, which are vastly different. And yeah, so I'm very like fascinated about that story and just like the idea of like, oh my God, you can just take earthenware and make it look like porcelain. Like I love that challenge. And so that's how I got into low fire. And then eventually Maiolica is it just made sense for my work because I like to paint on surfaces and Maiolica is just like a great medium to or technique to express that.
What you just said is so exactly my experience. Like I started off high fire. Actually, I started off cone six, went to high fire, and was sort of seduced by all of that. And then when I learned about the history of people copying the high fire works with low fire materials, that felt like what it was like to be a middle class kid in Southwest Virginia trying to put on fancier clothes than what I could afford. Like my grandma made some of my clothes when I was a kid. And I was like, this is exactly like people decorating like porcelain, except I was putting on like fake skater clothes to look like
Totally.
the cool kids.
Yeah, and it totally feels like a little naughty too, because like, when I told my uncle, I was like, I'm into this low fire stuff, he really like poo-pooed it and he was just like, no, it's about porcelain. Why are you not doing cone 10?
Well, there's so much history in Jingdezhen. Is Jingdezhen, is that where the factory was?
No, he was in Qingdao.
Gotcha. Okay. Like, yes, porcelain is obviously beautiful and there's so much made in multiple locations in China, but also they had the material. So they were using their local material. It just also was porcelain. So it's kind of funny, this sort of mythic idea that porcelain is so great, because I always describe low fire as like the loving grandmother that treats you well and feeds you well and does everything great. And porcelain is like the really angry stepmom that's like hard to work with and yells at you. You know what I mean?
Totally. And it's like, low fire is such a short firing. Like, how wonderful is that? Like, I want to see the result now.
And the versatility, I mean, your career is an example of the versatility of Malika. Like you have a studio pottery line, which you've made for a long time, and then you also make figurative sculpture, but the materials and the technique, like the painting technique, is similar. So like a material that can do both of those, like, come on, that's the best.
Yeah, totally. And Maiolica doesn't fade away like the old sculptures, so.
Well, let's start talking about the pots, because that was the first way that I learned about your work. So can you talk about, let's talk about the name, like, because you have a brand that you've built around a name. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it's called Rat Chicks, and that's kind of the project name that I went by, and it's spelled Rat X Chicks. And so I thought of like a bird and a rat breeding, two of like New York City's pests breeding that drive me crazy. And what if what is the outcome of this? And that's kind of where it started. And I liked the name of it, and also is like a play on the words ratchet and rad chicks. And really, it's about humor. And it's very focused on surface decoration. So initially, I just was drawn to like, okay, how do I fill the surface in a way? And I just loved like the strategy of it, of like making the pattern, and really the idea behind it is like, how do I bring in different elements together and create harmony. That's kind of like the simplified version of it, but and just kind of like pulling in things that, like, I don't know, toothbrushes, like really leaning into the absurdity of it, like toothbrushes and oyster shells, and kind of like thinking about bringing animals. And it's kind of like now in hindsight, I think it's like it's about escapist it's kind of like an escapist fantasy, which I think is what attracts people to it. And yeah, it's like a playful expression. And I did it, I feel like last year I kind of made the most number of pieces out of my studio I've ever done. And I think by the end of last year, I feel like I've kind of like exhausted the idea of rat chicks. Like I've pretty much done like every kind of pattern organization and pattern combo and butter dishes. Butter dishes were like a specialty thing of rat chicks. And I guess I was like, I think at the end of 23, I was really kind of yearning for the stuff that's underneath the surface. So I just started like all these questions were coming about, and maybe it has something to do with like reaching my 40s. In 24, I was really kind of like reflecting on myself and really I wanted to take a new direction. But yeah, so Ratchix is like the functional pottery that I was really involved with for several years. And yeah, I loved it. I think I just like hit a wall or something with it though.
Well, also, it's a more is more aesthetic, both with the amount of pattern, like almost all the spaces were filled with pattern or subject matter, like the animals you talked about, but also the color scheme. Like you were putting layers of very bright colors beside each other. So, as a maker and as a viewer, like it's saturation to the max.
Oh yeah.
How do you figure out how to make that? Like, I feel like if I tried to do what you did, it would just look like a blob of like badness. So, like, how do you keep? I'm trying to think of an elegant way to ask a question. How do you make it make sense for the viewer when there's so much happening on the surface?
Oh, that's a good question. Not sure how to answer that because I guess I would have to talk about like my process and how I go
Sure.
about the patterns. First, I'm thinking, about okay, in this particular piece, I want to bring in bananas and telephones and whatnot. And I think even selecting the object, I'm already thinking about how the color of those objects and the shape of those objects would come together. And then I'm already thinking about the space in between and how I'm going to like bring in florals or vine patterns or something like that to weave them all in together. So it's kind of, it starts there with like the idea. And then, I usually like sketch it out. It's kind of like creating a map, I guess it's kind of like a grid, but I'm trying to like so I sketch it all down. But I think like the act of it really just goes back to the nature of low fire. And really when I first started doing low fire, I realized that layering was going to be super important for me, starting with the dark clay, coating it with something light, and then it's color. So like, I'm also thinking about what the background Maiolica color is going to be and how that's going to interact with all of the washes and the colors on top. So, just I guess there are multiple layers stacked on top of each other, starting with the clay itself, and then yeah, and then all the colors on top.
I think what you're saying about the process helping to shape the content is interesting because I think with low fire, because you do have to build such a layer after layer after layer, for me as the viewer, I'm seeing it as a whole, but you are probably thinking about, well, I'm only doing this in this section, so that's not that complicated. Then I'm just doing another thing either on top of it or beside it. That's not that complicated. But when you build it up, holy cow, is it complicated? There's
Yeah.
like a lot going on the surface. Do you do a lot of waxing, like put down a central motif, then wax around it, and then do a layer?
Yeah, so the wax treatment at the end will allow me to put like a final wash over it, and then you can see the original base Maiolica, which I tint with a stain, and so you can see that contrasted against the darker, usually a darker wash over the base. But yeah, it's a lot of wax.
Yeah, and not having things smudge is so important with Malika because if you can rub the color, but you could also rub the glaze off the pot, and that is not great.
Definitely not. But bentonite will help that.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about that because that hardens the surface. That's the effect.
Yeah, I mean, when I was first like getting into Maiolica, like I was trying out different stains, and yeah, I had that smudging problem, and I was like, this is not going to work because I have to handle the piece and work at it in the round if it's like a cup object. And so yeah, so I've, mixing a little bentonite in the stain just like helps me be able to like touch the piece after I paint it.
For the book that you're in, and thank you for sending images and being a part of it because the work is like such a good comparison. Like the comparison between you and Linda Arbuckle on the page that you're on is like a really nice comparison of approach with the same material. But almost all Maiolica artists have to come up with something because it is a challenging process. And because of that, I noticed that the cost of your work is higher than, let's say, like a stoneware pot dunked in some matte glaze. Could you talk about like figuring out how to price your labor? Because also you live in New York City where life is expensive.
Air is expensive here. Breathing is. Yeah, that was really tricky because it's hard to convince someone that a mug is $120, but $120 for the mug that I would make barely covered the labor. I mean, I got pretty fast over time, just figuring out the production part of it. But yeah, it really should have been more. And just in terms of like the mug, I think with the functional stuff, like I eventually just kind of like did a time study. So I figured out, okay, this is like exactly the number of minutes it takes for me to make a mug. And I just kind of started from there. And I landed on 120 and 150. But still, I think it was like underpriced for the labor, but I would use that. Yeah. And then just kind of price everything accordingly based on size. So.
I always tag it to what do you pay if you go out for a nice dinner? And in New York City, like a nice dinner or not a nice dinner, a medium dinner, $120 is about right. But then something like a butter dish, which is something that you've done a lot of that was kind of a signature form, like that's a much more complicated form. It's two parts. There's a whole different thing. So the pricing of that relative to the mug seemed a little cheap. Like I kind of felt like you could have charged even more for those. So how do you figure out like what's the top you need to get for you, but not to outprice yourself?
That's why I landed on 420 for the custom pieces. I was selling them at first like a little under 300, but then I was like, this doesn't make any sense with the labor involved, and because I don't slip cast either, so everything is done by hand, and so then it went up to 380. And then really the custom ones, because they were just a little bit more involved, I would charge 420. And it's kind of a lot to ask for a butter dish, but I think for all of the people that I made these butter dishes for, I think they saw it as a little piece of sculpture in their house that they can use every day. And so I think yeah, 420. If I had charged more, I feel like I don't know, I probably wouldn't have made as many. I'm not sure. I never really experimented past 420, and I thought that was like a very fair price for the piece. Yeah, and the prices just all have to make sense in relation to each other, like it can't be 600 if the mug is only 120 or, so.
Well, let's switch gears and talk about the sculptural work. So, am I right in thinking that you've always made both, but that it kind of went like you're going to make pots for a while and then stop making pots and then make sculpture? Like, what's the balance between the two in the studio?
Yeah, for a long time when I was developing Ratchix, I had this thought of, okay, well, I love ceramics so much that I will make tableware and that will sustain my studio practice, and I will create time to develop sculptural work. And as you may know, with production, the nature of production is when you start, you're on a hamster wheel and you have to keep going, and you just can't get out of it, and you really have to like create immense amount of discipline to get out of it. And really sculpture is something you need more time and more breathing room to think critically about the ideas that you're working through. And so I think I realized in 23 that this model wasn't going to work. And although I was working on sculptural pieces here and there, it didn't feel like I had the continuity that I wanted in order to, um, yeah, just to delve deeper, like into all the ideas. And so luckily this year, like I went to Township 10, and so my year started there. And really all the sculptural work that I'm making right now, it kind of stems from the ideas that I was working through at that residency. And I can talk a little bit more about the themes that I was working through, but yeah, I kind of like started from there. And then right after that, my residency started at the Museum of Arts and Design. And that's really where I think I really kind of was able to, I'm given a space and the resources, and it was a really special time to like be able to focus deeply. And I think focus deeply on the sculptural work. And that's where I realized like this is where I need to be, and I cannot produce the mugs anymore because it's going to distract me from the sculpture.
Yeah, and I feel like content wise, the shift was really big. It feels like the sculpture is really personal. You're not necessarily always telling a narrative, but you're making characters that are part of a bigger narrative, or at least as the viewer, I'm trying to figure out what the narrative is. So it's, I think, starts with questions on your end and makes me think about questions on my end. So, can you talk about how the content shifts when you're working with the figure specifically?
Really, what happened is like when I went to Township 10, I just went back to what I was initially interested in when I started doing pottery on the wheel. Like I was just drawn to traditional Korean ceramics. Moon jars was like, always this thing of fascination for me prior to the low fire stuff. Um, and I think like after a trip in 2016 to Korea and seeing contemporary ceramics and seeing the moon jar just appear over and over and over again, I think that really like stuck with me because I started thinking about like what is this moon jar about? It felt very important for me to just explore that. And I think I maybe had friction with this idea of recreating the moon jar like as perfectly as possible with the porcelain. And I think maybe it drove me a little crazy. And I had this urge to like go back to that first love of Korean pottery. And I was interested in reinterpreting this moon jar. And I think at first, when I think about the moon jar, I think about fertility. And so I started thinking about the women in my family. And so I started doing a series of busts that are inspired by the stories of women in my family. And so I kind of started with that. And then, a part of that series, I was also interested in like playing around with the form itself. And you probably already know, but the, the moon jar is like about dualities. It's about the two bowls coming together. And, that just like, it just makes perfect sense for me as a Korean American woman of just like always feeling like there are two sides of this thing of me in my existence. And I should also mention, like, I was born in the US and then I moved to Korea when I was 11 and went to traditional schooling. And it was a huge culture shock for me. I was already very Americanized psychologically before I went to Korea, and then just experiencing this whole other thing. And it's funny because, like, when I first moved to Korea, like prior to that, like I told all my white friends in the suburbs of Boston. I'm like, I'm going back. Like, I'm going to my mother country. And I was like super excited. But when I got there, it was like a whole nother thing, like very militaristic and the idea of collectivism. So it's like really strong. And I never really felt that before. And you feel it through the language, but really going to school there and my interactions with my peers, I didn't speak any Korean too when I first went there. And experiencing like a very militaristic style of education there, and corporal punishment, really. I think this experience just left a huge mark on me, and it keeps coming back. And, in the surface decoration of the functional pottery, I think really it symbolizes, like, when I talk about bringing disparate elements together, I'm really thinking about the differences between my cultures of, American individualism and Korean collectivism and how those things can melt together. And that's in the moon jar. The moon jar, again, two bowls put together. And so at the Museum of Arts and Design, I really kind of part of the series was like just exploring the form itself and breaking it apart, deconstructing it and putting it together. And that reconstruction is really is my identity is Korean, being Korean and American. It's constantly evolving every day. You pick and choose kind of like what parts of it you want to have.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Bray epoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Bray epoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
I had read some writing that was done. I'm not sure if this was writing that you had done or Mad was writing about your work. So please correct me if I'm wrong. But the comparison was that the moon jar for Korean culture, the way you personalized that was to look at your mother's hair and think about like what hairstyles and also just like cosmetics, like essentially like your public face. Like it's about like how do you go out in public? That was actually a representation for you for the moon jar or a sense of Korean identity. So can you talk about that? Just this idea of like your public face, like the way you decorate yourself as you go out in your mother and other women you saw in your family?
Yeah, I think it's like a response to what the Korean moon jar has come to symbolize in intellectualizing the moon jar in the Korean art context. It kind of symbolizes the identity of Korea and perfection through imperfection, um, and it holds a lot of these ideas that I feel like are not very true in our real lives, in everyone's personal lives, and that we are extremely flawed. And so when I think about the hair, I was like, my mother and the women in my mother's generation, their hair is yeah, it's kind of like the moon jar in that you're putting this outward perfection. I don't know, this outward perfection, and it's sculpture. Like eh, they spent hours perfecting this image of the perfect hair, and the perfect hair, the height of it, and the way the curls form, like all of the details is like just how they project their sense of status in this social order. And I guess too, personally, like when I think about their hair, it's like my mother never allowed me to touch their hair. um she would always like kind of shoo me away, telling me that I would, like, mess up her hair that day, but
I think that public face being really important is the way you express yourself in a collectivist culture, as to where
yes.
in an individualistic culture, like say New York City, like look how many different styles you could see of clothes in any given day just walking down the street.
Right.
I mean, you can see this also, I feel like, in music and in film and in all of these cultural things that we make to display ourselves. You see it differently in K-pop and in Korean film than you do in Korean Americans making those same things, music and film. So I think there's like
Yeah.
some interesting back and forth that's happening that you got to experience firsthand as an 11-year-old, which must, I mean, that must have been tough. I was thinking about what I was going through when I was 11. Oh boy, like you survived.
I did, yeah. But I guess what I was trying to say about the permed hair is that it's about conformity and, like,
Yes.
and I experienced that going to Korea, like, having to conform as a way of survival, really, because you don't wanna be seen as separate from the group. Like, it's very much, like, enforced that your actions, um reflect on the whole. So I think the permed hair is about that conformity, and really what's inside that permed hair is all this messy stuff, like messy emotions and lived personal lives that are in contrast to the perfection of that hair.
And I love seeing the work, but on your website, people can see like this broader series, which there's multiple women that you're depicting, and you see generational shift. You know, like there's the age of the women shifts depending on who you're depicting, but also you see some women in more of like a traditional headdress. The piece that has like the
Stripes.
yes. So can you talk about that generational shift, wanting to depict what would be, I guess, your grandmother's age and also your mother's age in traditional dress or non-traditional?
I think I see it as like it's just my generation, and then everyone, all of my mother and my grandmother looped into one thing. I haven't really thought about that. Can you elaborate, like, on, like, what your question is? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, when I'm thinking, because you're depicting three distinct generations, like grandmother, mother, and then you, it just reminds me about how different my father's life was. My father is, I think, your more your grandmother's age. What they lived through and what they experienced is just so different than what we're living through. And I mean, they're still, my dad's still alive, but I see generational shift happening because my dad and I, and my mom in some respect, are getting farther apart as we age, because the reality of what they see the world as and the reality of the world I've experienced firsthand is just different. So I'm feeling the generational shift a lot right now in my family.
mhm.
And I guess maybe I'm reading into that, into your work. Like as the viewer, I see some of that there too, which it might not be that's your intent. That's just what I'm putting on it.
Yeah, I've never been asked that question before, but it's interesting because I'm like thinking about it now, and yeah, it's total contrast between my life and the lives of women in my family. And I guess I haven't really thought too deeply about, yeah, the difference between my mother and my aunts, their generation, as opposed to my grandmother's generation, who lived through the Japanese occupation in Korea, and saw the Korean War and all of that. I experienced that generational shift just in everyday conversation. My parents live in Korea. It's a different time zone. And so when we talk, yeah, it's really hard to access each other. one, because we're physically separated, and two, I think culturally, I mean, they lived here in the US for, I think, 18 years or so. So they do kind of understand American culture, but, they haven't lived here in a very long time. So they don't. And then also, being an artist, I think sometimes it's hard for them to understand, although doing ceramics for them makes sense because my uncle did it. And that's really the only, I think, maybe the main reason why they kind of get it. Until we talk about the sculptures and they're like, oh, what, that doesn't really look like your aunt. I'm like, well, it's not about that.
That's hilarious. There's nothing like your parents to like give you that comment that's kind of positive, kind of negative, but it hits like a sledgehammer. You're like, come on, guys.
A lot of criticism for sure.
Well, I wanted to talk about the work you have in the future of clay at the Clay Studio. Angelique Viscarando-Laboy co-curated that with Jennifer Zwilling. I'll put a link in the show notes to that show so that people can check out the work. But one of the pieces that you made was a stewardess, like an airline stewardess. And well, first, can you just describe what that piece tells about the experience of traveling internationally?
Yeah, I think it hit me coming. So in February, this past February, I went to visit my parents, whom I haven't seen for 7 years. And unfortunately, my dad has dementia now, so he doesn't remember much. And so it was a very emotional experience. Like, 7 years is a really long time, and I feel I kind of regret it. But it's always on that plane. It's like, it's just so, I just think about so many things, about life and existence and culture. And then it's like the whole 15-hour ride, I'm like presented with these beautiful flight attendants who like just take care of you and comfort you, and they're really bizarre too, because because the whole time I'm just staring at them, like I feel kind of creepy, but because like every detail of their outfit and their hair, and it's just so perfect. Like everything is like orchestrated in a way that just makes you feel like, and I think part of it is propaganda. It's like having, just like having this devotion to your country, and they are like moon jars to me. They represent the Korean national like identity, and somehow I'm supposed to like feel. I feel connected to it, but also not, because it's not that perfect. It's very complicated. The history is very complicated. Um, and so it kind of started with that. I'm like, oh, I felt this urge, like I need to sculpt them. They're like sculptures. And so it's really like they kind of represent this idea of home. And like home is for me very complicated because again, like I've had these experiences growing up in two places, and it's weird because I find the most peace on an airplane. I love flying, and I love that 15-hour like almost meditation on life. And it's feel the most comforted, and and my boyfriend always thinks like it's kind of weird, but because he hates flying and it's terrifying for him, but I just love the sound of being on that plane, and I feel very calm, and it almost is like representative of my existence of like being in between two places all the time.
In a plane, you're out of control, but I think it's a way to accept that you're out of control. And I think that's like the meditation aspect of it is like, okay, the pilot knows what they're doing. I'm just going to relax. I actually, for years when I was teaching a lot of workshops, it was often the only time that I could rest. Because when I was at home, I was making so much work. When I was teaching. And on the plane, I, like you, felt like, this is great.
Yeah, and you're like eating Korean food, and it just, you surrender to the experience, and I think that's what I love about it.
How big is that piece?
It stands at 46 inches tall, I think.
That technically, with Myalica, that is a lot of sculpture to make work.
Yeah.
when you're making a pot, the risk is different than a 46-inch tall sculpture. So how do you pull that off technically? Because that was the piece you made that at the Mad residency, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you pull it off?
Yeah, so I had to work through some technical things. Like the kiln was like a medium-sized kiln, so I knew I couldn't build it in one shot. So yeah, it's built in sections. I build it with coils. I find that coils are much stronger than slabs. And so from bottom to top, I started at the feet and then I got to the knees. And when I got to the knees, I was like, oh my God, everything needs to stand on these like two legs. So I had to like kind of figure that out. But yeah, I kind of it's made in 4 different sections, but I built it with all of the parts stacked on top of each other, with like supporting coils and stuff. And I'm making another one right now, but I'm not building it in the same way. It's actually, I was actually thinking like it's much easier to make it in sections actually, because you don't have to work against gravity. So yeah, that's kind of how I built that one, and then it's attached with epoxy at the end.
Did you spray? Because obviously you can't dunk a figure. So did you spray your glaze, or how did you do that on a figure that large?
The Myolica parts of it. So with these pieces, like I wanted to start playing around with like glossy and non-gloss or matte. So I wanted to move away from like just heavily glazing everything. So I used terra sigillata. So a lot of it actually isn't really glazed. But the parts that are glazed with the Myolica, the shiny parts, those are all just, they're brushed on.
There are other vessels that were a part of that Future of Clay show that are not the Rat Chicks line of work. They're, I think, conceptually really dense and beautiful. I think
Thank
the
you.
work you have in that show is pretty amazing. So can you talk about the non-figure aspects of that?
Well, I think of all of them, the figure and the vessels and stuff, all rooting back to this moon jar. I keep talking about the moon jar, but yeah. So the vessels are an exploration of the form of that moon jar. And well, some of them are kind of thinking about it more conceptually, but like for example, in the Future of Clay, there's a piece called Hodori, and Hodori is the tiger mascot of the 1988 Seoul Olympics. And the tiger can be seen put together and then apart. When it's together, it holds a plate, and the plate is in the shape of the Korean Peninsula. And I thought of that piece as representing the North and South Koreas, which is still divided. And that tiger is holding a moon jar at the center that comes apart and then comes together. So, like, that's one iteration of the moon jar. Another piece in there, uh, they're all kind of like deconstructed and then put together. So, the other piece, I believe, in the Future of Clay, yeah. So, it's like a stacked form. And then so that one, I'm building the moon jars as a whole and then cutting them apart and then adding slabs and seeing how they're all like kind of puzzle pieces, really. And so they stack on top of each other, and there are multiple ways of seeing it. It can be taken apart again and put together. And I really liked that idea. And then for those pieces, I do think that I had to go through these like vessels, the moon jar vessels, in that way in order to get to the flight attendant. Um, because I'm working through like what the surface decoration, how the surface decoration that I so intensely did with Ratchix, like how does that translate into these sculptures? And I think I realize I'm moving away from it, but those pieces like do have like certain parts that are sectioned off with a different style of surface decoration, but maybe more of a simplified version. But I'm kind of like working through stories with them more so. Like a couple of those pieces in the Future of Clay, they're about this incident called Nutgate. or nut rage, which is really funny, and tragic at the same time. But so it's this thing that happened 10 years ago on Korean Airlines. The vice president, Heather Cho, got on the plane and was served a bag of macadamia nuts, unopened, so still in the packaging, and she freaks out. She flips out and attacks the flight attendant because they weren't opened for her and served on a tray. And then, got the plane to turn around and kicked, she like
Wow.
attacked the flight, attacked them and like
Okay.
kicked them off the plane. And it's like opera to me. I find it really like humorous and dark, which is like a theme in a lot of like popular Korean film, like I don't know if you know Bong Joon-ho's movies, like The Parasite.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, so like dark humor, I feel like is often a theme in like Korean cinema and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, this Nutgate thing is like exactly that. It really just captures like Korean society. Not that all of society is like that, but it's just, yeah. So Heather Cho eventually, she served 5 months in jail or whatever. There was a national outcry. And what's really funny about this too is like the sale of macadamia nuts right after just like soared through the roof. And so, yeah, a couple of those pieces have like paintings of, a flight attendant serving a tray of nuts, and which then sparked another sculptural piece. It's a smaller flight attendant, and it's in a show right now at Ruby Dakota in New York City. And that one is of a smaller flight attendant serving 2 nuts on a tray.
There's so much in this work. I mean, the story of the Nutgate thing is an example of how collectivist cultures are enforced. Like the boss is the boss and you do what the boss says. And if you don't do what the boss says, you're in big trouble. Like that's kind of a metaphor for collectivist culture as a whole. There's often enforcement of the collective thing.
Yes.
But also it's just macadamia nuts. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in some ways it means a lot. In some ways it means nothing,
Totally.
It's kind of interesting. But what I love about the work is that when you put the pot together, it says one thing. And when you it's almost like bookends, like you could like almost like take them apart and read what's on the inside as a formal device. So good. I feel like that's something that you could keep working with. The Tiger the same is like what you first see and what you see on exploration of the object is different. That's good sculpture, I think. And it's also good vessels.
Thank you so much. That's really kind of you to say.
To wrap up, can you plug either your social media or other ways that people could get in touch with you if they want to talk about any of this?
Yeah, so on Instagram, my handle is ratchicks, but it's spelled rat X in the middle, and then chicks, CHICKS. And you can kind of see everything that I'm making and shows that I'm in. And of course, you can go to my website through that.
Yeah, and The Future of Clay, that's up at the Clay Studio till December 31st. And the Brooklyn show, we can't forget that.
Oh, yeah, the Brooklyn Museum, yeah.
You're in a museum show, which is amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about it.
And it's a major survey. It's 200 artists from Brooklyn in the Brooklyn Museum. I mean, it's kind of rare, I feel like, that they actually do have a local focus in that way for contemporary artists that are not painters. I mean, every time I go there, I see painters, it feels like. Well, thanks. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been incredible, and I've always wanted to talk to you, so this is really great. So thank you so much.
I wanted to thank Michelle for coming on the show. I'm such a fan of her work. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and the Archie Bray Foundation. If your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving if you're in the States. I hope you're in a turkey coma at this moment while you're listening to this, filled with cranberry sauce, stuffing, and your favorite pie. As always, thanks for listening, and I will see you next week. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.